Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the second session of the webinar series, Making of Modern Georgia, hosted by the Georgian Association in the USA. My name is Salome Stevens. I'm currently the president of the Georgian Association. And if you haven't joined our first session, let me give you a brief introduction about what is happening here and what we're about to do. So we have the pleasure today of having Mr. Nikoloz Aleksidze and Mr. Stephen Jones joining us for the second session in this series. The idea of this series started with the thought that, Georgia is in the news. Georgia has become more known around the world over the last few decades, but we don't often have an opportunity to give context to the modern day of Georgia and what is happening in Georgia in our lifetime, and especially for people outside of Georgia. And so it was important, we thought, to create a series that would give everyone a bit of a background for how did it come about? How did the Georgia that we know today come about? What do we need to know about its culture, about its history? And this would be done through webinars, which would be online, as well as in-person activities and events throughout the United States, which is where we're based. So this is a second session in this series. We have a recording of the first session that is available on YouTube and on our website. And we also already had our first in-person activity that was just this Friday, which was a visit to the Library of Congress to see in person the materials from the First Democratic Republic of Georgia, which was the theme and the topic for previous sessions conversation. So I hope that you are able to take time and watch that recording if you haven't participated before. And for the next year in 2026, we will be continuing this series. And at the end of this session, you will have an opportunity to look at the information about the upcoming session. We're going to be talking about Georgian language, which is so important to our country and culture. And there will be more sessions coming up throughout the year. So I hope that you will come back and participate. And if you are not available, go back and watch the recordings, which will always be posted on our YouTube channel. And as the in-person activities are also scheduled, we will be posting them to our social media website channels like Facebook and LinkedIn, but also always updated on our website. So I'd recommend spreading the word so we have more people participating and learning about Georgia and our rich history and culture. So without further ado, let me hand it over to Professor Jones today for as the host. He was the guest last week or last session, and now today he's the host. He's currently the board member of the Georgian Association in the USA, and of course has a long and rich history of studying Georgia and setting up the program on Georgian studies at the Davis Center at Harvard University. So without further introductions, because he is very well known to most people on this session, Stephen, let me hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Salome. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Magazal Mabit. I am delighted to have Professor Nikoloz Aleksidze with us for this session. It's the second session that we've had in this series, which was inspired by Salome. It will go into the fall of next year, and we have, I believe, at least a fascinating and diverse selection of themes about the making of modern Georgia. And I encourage you to look at our program and think ahead and register for some of the sessions. I'm going to introduce Professor Aleksidze, and then I'm going to hand it over to him. He will talk to you and me for about 15 to 20 minutes with a slideshow focusing on his work, which focuses, as you probably know, on the medieval period in Georgia. His recent book, Sanctity, Gender and Authority in Medieval Caucasia, which was published in 2024, has made a very big splash. And I'm currently reading his not the Cult of Warrior Saints, sorry, I'm reading his A Cultural Journey Through the Wardrop Collection, which was also published in 2024. He's been really productive in the last 2 or 3 years. And I would recommend highly both those books. They're really extraordinary explorations of Georgian history, identity, particularly connection with the Georgian church. Um, and as I say, highly recommended. I think I can fairly say that Professor Aleksidze is really one of the most outstanding young scholars of Georgian medieval history, and we're, as I said, very welcome, very pleased to have him here. I'd just like to just say a few words. He's the professor of history of religion and political thought, an interesting combination there. It's not just about religion, it's about religion and politics at the Free University of Tbilisi. He's the dean there of social sciences. Previously, he was a research associate and a junior research fellow at the University of Oxford, where he'd early obtained his DPhil in Oriental Studies. A very long and very rich tradition of Georgian studies at Oxford, which Professor Aleksidze has continued. And as I mentioned, he's already published 3 or 4 books about his work on the medieval period in particular. Um, he is he has co-edited and co-authored with Ekaterine Gedevanishvili an edited volume called The Cult of Warrior Saints in Medieval Georgia, which was published this year. Um, I just want to mention too that we had him at the program on Georgian Studies in the fall of last year. He was a visiting scholar at the Davis Center, and it was a delight having him and listening to his work. Actually, I think he may tell us a little bit about this, working on Svaneti right now. I think that's enough to I have said. Again, a delight. And I'm going to hand it over to Professor Aleksidze, who will talk, as I said, for 15-20 minutes. We will then have a conversation. I'll ask him some questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Nikoloz.
Right. Thank you, Stephen, for the extremely kind words, and also, first of all, thank you for the invitation to speak and the for the seminars. I will. So I'm supposed to I will start with a short introduction, but related to the topic, and then we'll probably continue with the discussion, the questions. Can we go to the next slide, please? I just wanted to start with just saying a few words about myself and what I do and why I'm speaking about what I'm speaking about tonight. During the last 10 years or so, I've been specifically interested in the history of religion and political thought in the Caucasus, in Armenia, Georgia, the rest of Caucasia, but also the wider region of Eastern Mediterranean. And one of the results was this book, Sanctity, Gender and Authority in Medieval Caucasia, which was published in Edinburgh. And in this book, I'm examining how the cult of saints, sanctity in general, the cult of relics, contributed to the history of to political rhetoric in late antiquity, and how latent tropes, as it were shaped and then recycled and reused throughout the Middle Ages, but not just the Middle Ages, but also how medieval concepts of sanctity, the interaction of sanctity, political rhetoric, and also gender in Georgia and Armenia, which is quite relevant to the topic, how these contribute to contemporary political rhetoric in Georgia, political and religious rhetoric in modern Georgia. So that's what this book is about, if you're interested. And I'm particularly proud of our recent work, where I have a relatively peripheral role, actually, and Ekaterine is certainly the leading scholar in this edited volume. And this is the book on the edited volume on the cult on the soldier saints in medieval Georgian art. So what we examine here is the visual representation of several major soldier saints in medieval Georgian art and their place in political rhetoric, in the concepts of political legitimization, foreign policy, internal policy, power rhetoric, power dynamic, and these sorts of things. But also not just the visual aspects, but also obviously we try to have an interdisciplinary approach. And finally, I'll also say a few words about what I'm doing now. I've spent probably last 6 to 7 years researching the Highland, the Georgian Highlands, particularly Svaneti, and we've had several. We every year we organize field work there, and on my next project, what I'm working on currently is the formation of political and religious communities and their functioning in major transit zones, such as the Caucasian Highlands. So I'm interested in how religious experience, religious political experience, and piety in general interacts with landscape, with sacred and political space, with objects, because it's heavily object-based research, because Svaneti is a very object-based culture, and obviously the local people. So it is a certain study of the ecology of Svanetian religious and political practices in the context of of landscape. So this is the general overview of what I'm interested in currently. And as for our current topic, so if we if we speak about the history of Georgian monasticism, that basically means that we have to discuss the entire history, intellectual history of Georgia. So obviously this will be fairly impossible to do. So what I decided to do is just mention one aspect that could also serve as a certain anchor for our further discussion, and this is the issue of continuity. One of the texts that is not really relevant to our topic that I like to discuss with my students is an early 20th century short tract by a writer called Nikoloz Aleksidze, who's written this short tract called Thoughts on Georgia. And in these thoughts on Georgia, what he does is basically he complains a lot. And his major topic of complaint is that Georgia as an intellectual phenomenon, or just as identity, lacks a sense of continuity. So he's basically deploring the lack of continuity, comparing Georgia's culture and Georgian heritage to, say, British, I think, and Western European, and comparing and contrasting and deploring the lack of this continuity in Georgia, as opposed to the presence of strong continuity in Western Europe. So basically, what he does, he discusses later on how this affects his sense of Georgianness. And what is interesting, and what I also often like to talk about also in these books, probably not this particular books, but the one published in 2018 in Oxford, is that much of medieval Georgian literature, monastic literature, as I said, more than 99% of medieval Georgian literature is monastic literature and pre-modern literature. That literature is focused on this sense of continuity or the lack of thereof. So what transpires quite often in medieval literature produced in the monasteries, both in Georgia and abroad, is the discussion on identity basically, on where the author and the text is situated vis-a-vis Georgia's past, Georgia's future, Georgia's neighbors, the cultural context of how to understand our place in the wider Christian ecumeny, in the universal, so to say, universal salvation history, in the grand political processes and transformations happening in the region, and how to sort of find Georgia's, whatever the political configuration of Georgia was at that specific time, how to find Georgia's place within these grand processes. So one of the important, let's say, contributions of medieval Georgian Christian literature to sort of say general history of intellectual history of Eastern Mediterranean is a focus on identity, discussions on the meaning of language, on the meaning of ethnicity vis-a-vis orthodoxy, or thoughts about the past, how the past is tied to the future, whether they're tied or not. What does orthodoxy mean? What does Georgianness mean in the context of, say, in the Eastern Roman context, and other related discussions, that some of those are apocalyptic, some of those are messianic. And it is within this, I would say, effective self-perception or someone would call it anxiety over identity and belonging, um, that some of the tropes that we're currently familiar with have emerged, and some of the most just persisting tropes of medieval Georgian political rhetoric that still exist and still uh, more than active in Georgia. And these are, for example, the narrative of the lot of the Mother of God, which was shaped in Georgian monastic communities. Can we go to the next slide, please, or the slide after, actually, the one after this? Yeah, in the Georgian monastic communities abroad, when the Georgians had to encounter the predominant presence of Greek monks, and most commonly these monks were hostile towards the Georgian strange Georgian language and strange Georgian looks and so on and so forth. So one of these strongest political concepts, which is the lot of the Mother of God, was formed in this context of anxiety of who are we, who we the Georgians are in this fairly hostile and alien circumstances. And other familiar tropes, such as, for example, kinship of the ruling dynasty of the Bagratid dynasty with the King David, the biblical King David, and via King David, obviously, with the Mother of God, has also been shaped within this context, obviously with the court. And this is another aspect that we will probably discuss in our conversation, is that the royal ideology and monastic ideology often converged, and at certain crucial points converged in Georgian writing, especially in 10th century and in the 11th century. Other very familiar concepts that are more object based, right, centered around the relics of the saints, around not just the saints, but around the relics of the foundational events of Christianity, such as the famed tunic of the Lord, or the holy nail, or the belt of the Mother of God, or other foundational relics of Christianity that allegedly, one way or another, ended up in Georgia. All of these were incorporated in identity rhetoric, in the rhetoric of political legitimization, whether during the consolidation of Georgian kingdom in 10th and 11th centuries, or during the disintegration of the Georgian kingdom into various principalities and smaller kingdoms, when the local rulers and kingdoms tried to create their own charismatic identities and try to create their own ties to try to establish their own, as were, inalienable ties with the foundations of Christianity. So all of these tropes that were gathered and collected by monks across the Eastern Mediterranean have been incorporated in Georgian political rhetoric. And they're very much alive today as well. So one of the things that I address in my book is how these concepts, specifically the lot of the Mother of God, the relics of the saints, the relics of Christ's relics and the relics of the saints, have been used and integrated in 19th century, 20th century, 21st century political rhetoric in Georgia, also social rhetoric, but also in foreign relations, specifically relations with Russia. So also in this sense, there's a certain sense of continuity for certain medievalism still exists in Georgian public life. I also just decided to show you a few maps to have a broad general understanding of where we're situated. So when we speak about Georgian monasticism, basically we speak about two aspects of it. One is the Georgian monasteries abroad, and by abroad you can see some of these monasteries here. Some of the major establishments were founded, especially in the 10th and 11th centuries. But practically all of these establishments, all of these medieval establishments, were in direct continuity, were the result of political upheaval, of political consolidation of the Georgian kingdom throughout the 10th century. And as you can see in the top right corner, this is the south western part of Georgia, which was the epicenter of the formation of Georgian identity in many different ways, when major Georgian monasteries were founded, and then sort of they started moving out and founding other monasteries within Byzantium and also the Middle East. I will actually probably stop at this point. I just wanted to sort of lay the groundwork and say and start with a claim that the sense of continuity and the lack of continuity and the constant quest of this continuity and the anxiety over the lack or presence of continuity and of identity implied in continuity, and that is continuity is also religious, temporal continuity, is a hallmark of medieval or pre-modern Georgian religious thinking, which has been inherited also, I think, is largely inherited also in contemporary Georgian political and religious rhetoric and narrative, or national narrative, so to say. This is what I wanted to say, and I think we'll be able to discuss further as well.
Yeah, Nikoloz, thank you so much. It's obviously extremely complicated history, but one of the things I want to focus on is this question of continuity, because when you think of the role of the Georgian Church, right? I know our narrative has changed, and now, in the 19th and 20th century, the Georgian Church was raised into this sort of very powerful institution that had preserved Georgian identity through a very difficult period of Georgian history when the kingdom broke up after the 12th century, with the arrival of the Mongols and so on. But this idea that there is an absence of continuity might sound strange, I think, to many of us today, when we think about the current narrative, at least about the role of the Georgian Church, because we would think, well, actually, there was considerable continuity, right? And partly created by the geopolitical environment, let's say, of Georgia at this time, which was very often hostile, and the Georgian Church, plays this role of sort of preserving Georgian culture through scripture, through manuscripts, through services in the church, and so on. So could you explore a little bit more this question about continuity and why this scholar, I didn't catch his name, Nikoloz, that you talked about for your students, the one you read,
Oh,
yeah, but why would he be saying that? That
yeah.
there's a lack of continuity.
Yes, he was not a scholar. He was a poet, one of the Cisper Ganzelevi actually, and
Uh-huh.
he was disillusioned in Georgia in general, in sort of the potential that Georgia culture has in the early 20th century when he was writing, and actually it is an extremely interesting piece of writing when he sort of jots down all the points of complaint that he has towards Georgia. And then all Georgian scholars after him, up until now, actually felt necessary to respond to him. And his son has collected those responses, and they've been published together as a response and criticism to his pessimistic approach towards Georgia. In general, I think it's an interesting discussion of the perception, self-perception of a Georgian intellectual in at the wake of the Soviet domination in Georgia. So when I was speaking about the continuity or the lack of continuity, I wanted to stress the fact that it's sort of a perceived lack of continuity. In many ways, there are many cases, actually very many cases, where in autochthonous local Georgian texts, there's a certain what you will notice quite often is that earlier texts are not particularly known in later generations. They're not really quoted. They're not really familiar with those texts. Some of the crucial texts of medieval Georgia, such as the Life of Gregory of Hansta, which is now perceived as a foundational text of Georgian identity and political unity, and it is hailed as such, and is presented as such in Georgian high schools, was not known at all until the first half of 20th century. It never played any role in Georgian identity discourse. However, when it was discovered and when it was integrated in national narrative, it occupied a centrality, because the reason it occupied centrality is because it resonated well with the late 19th century rhetoric of Ilya Jaujawadze, when his formula, the triadic formula of what constitutes Georgianness, nation, faith, and language, nation, and faith. The the sources of this claim were sought and were discovered, but not really discovered, but were sort of allegedly discovered in this 10th century narrative, right? Because it sort of created this perceived established this perceived continuity of what constitutes Georgianness throughout these 10 centuries. However, Ilya himself was absolutely unaware of this text. I'm sure he would have loved this text, but he didn't know about it. An extremely important aspect in terms of continuity is language. And language plays a central role in medieval Georgian religious text. And I don't just mean this bombastic, famous hymn, The Praise and Glory of the Georgian language, probably copied by Ioannis Zosime, probably not authored by him, but nevertheless, there was something that has such a huge influence. But I also mean other hagiographic writings. For example, the lives of the Athonite fathers, of Euthemius, of George, the Athonites. They're all about the language. The narrative of forgetting the literary trope of forgetting the language and then miraculously remembering Georgian language that George did, and the involvement of the Mother of God in his sort of major anamnesis when he starts speaking. He was a child when he left Georgia. His native tongue was Greek by then, but sort of the Mother of God brought back his inherent sort of Platonic knowledge of Georgian language, and then he started writing in fluent and excellent Georgian. And there are many other texts that are very focused on the role of language in identity, like the life of Ilarion the Georgian, or many others. And that is the literary aspect of it. But the practical aspect is that medieval Georgian as a language is a fairly conservative phenomenon. I'd say more conservative than, say, medieval Armenian, for example. And there was a certain tendency towards, not a tendency, but a certain attempt, or there was a tendency to sort of preserve the Georgian language, to sort of fossilize the Georgian language as it was, as opposed to I would call it the bastardization of Georgian language that happened especially in the later medieval period, when many poets or self-proclaimed poets appeared and sort of butchered the language in many ways. So I'd say that one of the crucial aspects of ecclesiastical literature is the preservation of literary Georgian in its whatever pure form could mean in principle. Yeah.
So that's fascinating, because the question comes to mind is which language we are talking about, right? It was Ilya Chavchavadze, for example, who was calling for the secularization, if you like, of Georgian language, and particularly in its literary form, right? And he was fighting the fathers who were defending an older version of the Georgian language, right? That was based more on ecclesiastical forms, right? So when, it's very strange for me when we think of nationalism and its relation to language. What was the language they were talking about in the 11th century? Was it a language that was shared by Georgians more generally, or was this just a language that was essentially ecclesiastical, that was based on monks and scribes in monasteries? what was the relationship at that time? If you were talking about the glory of the Georgian language, is it the language we think about today?
Um, I, I- what I think happened is that there were several registers of language, and the language that we're familiar with is the highest register of this language, and we have very few, but some surviving graffiti that betray the spoken language and spoken aspects of this language. And there's a certain contrast in this. For example, I'm working on one of my current projects is I'm working on the metaphrastic hagiography. So all the hagiographic texts, the original hagiographic texts, were rewritten in a metaphrastic fashion by the Byzantines. However, a big chunk of these metaphrastic writings, these are embellishments, linguistic embellishments, narrative embellishments that were been lost, and they've survived only in Georgian. And that's probably something we'll also discuss later on. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because this particular kind of language or register in which these texts are written are extremely unapproachable. This is something that just the knowledge of medieval Georgian will not help at all. You just have to be completely immersed in this utterly artificial, utterly unapproachable, utterly over the top language in order to perceive it, to sort of just have a basic grasp of what's going on. We have so many calques from Greek, but also extremely artificial constructions. So my point is that uh, not that we're not necessarily familiar with various dialects in medieval Georgia, unlike probably Armenian, where there's a wider geographic range compared to Georgia. But we are familiar with several registers, various registers, philosophical registers, or Hellenophile registers, or just regular monastic registers. This is not exactly my area of expertise, but I still believe that these monasteries had a huge impact on the preservation of
Right.
literary Georgian language. But what happened afterwards is, for example, if one reads an early 19th century author is actually a contemporary author, such as Pilar del Poskiknadze, for example, who was one of the masterminds of the 1832 conspiracy. The register he writes in is an artificial imitation, if not a parody of medieval Georgian. It's not really a medieval Georgian language, but
Mm.
it is an attempt to create a stylized register. So I think what Ilya was really lashing out against was
Mm.
this stylized artificial thing. Yeah.
Right, right. Um, I mean, the reason I ask this is because we at Harvard recently acquired you were involved in giving us advice
Mhm.
on this, on the first Georgian printed Bible that was printed in Moscow in 1743, known as the Bakar Bible, or Bakar's Bible. And I remember when we received it at the Houghton Library, I went to look at it, and of course it was totally unreadable because it was in the Nushuri script, right? So it was the ecclesiastical script, and that so this idea that we have today about language and identity, I think, took a long time to come about, probably only sort of emerged in the 19th century, that although Zosimir talks about it, right, about, whoever speaking Georgian is where Georgia is, that concept really is much more of a 19th century democratic concept that, we all share the same language, which identifies us as Georgian or English or whatever it may be, right? Um, so the whole, although on the other hand, as you say, the monks and scribes were really very important in the continuity of keeping this language alive, although it went through many transformations, right? Um, but let me just move to the question and the map that you had up of all the monasteries that Georgians had founded. From, let's say, the 10th century, 11th century onwards, particularly obviously during the time of David the Builder and Queen Tamar, when Georgia played an extremely important role in the Middle East, right? And I like to think about these monks and scribes, who were founding the monasteries, as you can see here on this map, all over the Eastern Mediterranean, were in some sense the first Georgian diaspora, and they played a very important role in Christendom generally, right? And I think you talk about this in your work about the fact that Georgian scribes and monks actually preserved or translated texts exclusively in Georgian that have been lost in other languages. In other words, they played a very important role, not only in terms of preserving national culture, but also in preserving and promoting Christian culture. That's a role that maybe we don't recognize so much today. But they were really important as part of the world of Christendom. I wonder if you could talk a little more about that.
Mm. Yeah, the expression that you use, diaspora, I think is fairly apt because when we say diaspora, the first thing that comes to our mind is that there must be a certain, at least some kind of connection between the homeland and the diaspora. And this connection transpires in this case. For example, in the lives of the Athonite fathers, it is the whole book, the whole biographies of these people were written uh, were written as a certain testament to this as a, as a as a project to sort of translate as much as possible from Greek to into Georgian and to send those books back to Georgia. In Mount Sinai, for example, we have many endowments by Georgian kings, especially by King David, and also in Mount Athos, and the other monasteries, the monastery of the Holy Cross, or the monastery on Cyprus, and everywhere. This connection between the mainland and the monasteries, it remained quite strong, and the movement and the mobility of monks, mobility of manuscripts, and mobility of ideas was very active, as evidenced by some of the most famous manuscripts, say, for example, Hadishi Gospel, the manuscript that traveled all around the Near East and Anatolia, traveled to Georgia, and then finally ended up in Svaneti, in the remote village, in one of the remote villages in Svaneti. And this high degree of mobility of manuscripts and objects, even icons and other objects, is a testament to this connectivity between and the sense of a network between monasteries abroad and in Georgia. So this is one aspect. But the other aspect, I think, that would implied in your question is that is the contribution of Georgian monasteries to Christian culture in general. Um, one of the most important contributions, I think, is that um, is the preservation of texts that have become rather redundant or lost for various reasons in especially in Greek. And one of the best examples is, for example, the liturgy of Jerusalem, which has been preserved in its fullest in Georgian. The reason being that in the originals of the early Christianity, the liturgy was Jerusalemite, based in the Holy Land, and most churches adhered to this particular rite. But then the Church of the Constantinopolitan, with the Byzantinization of the Holy Land, the Constantinopolitan liturgy took over, and the Greeks switched to this new rite, whereas the earlier texts were lost mostly because they become redundant. However, Georgian manuscripts have preserved these earlier layers in its, I'd say, in its fullest, in all sorts of liturgical books and liturgical calendars, and whether in palimpsest or in other forms, and not necessarily, and I'm saying that not necessarily, and also one reason being that the liturgy of Jerusalem, it sort of survived in Georgian tradition much longer than in Byzantine tradition. But the other important thing is that in many ways, these manuscripts that contained the early, they say, redundant liturgy, have turned from texts into objects of devotion. They've become sort of objectified as items, that as holy items that were carried around. That is one of the reasons why many of these manuscripts ended as a pre-Constantinopolitan manuscripts ended up in Svaneti, where most people couldn't even read it properly. They didn't really
Right.
care whether it was old the liturgy or new liturgy. What mattered was as a holy object. So at some point, these objects were fossilized and therefore sort of maintained their identity throughout all these periods. And this was also true of other things. For example, it is due to some Georgian scribes of Mount Sinai who well, it's not thanks to them, but sort of also thanks to them probably is that they decided to erase the Albanian text, but were not really successful in erasing it fully, and to overwrite them with Georgian text. And that's one of the reasons we have Caucasian Albanian manuscripts now. And also, this is sort of an unintended result. But in other cases, such as the unusual survival of metaphrastic texts, of very Constantinopolitan, very high Byzantine text in Georgian, is specifically because of the interest that the Georgian monks in the 11th and 12th century had in everything Byzantine, in everything Hellenic, and were extremely eager to sort of maintain, translate every bit and piece of writing in Greek. And this was a very intentional process, so much so that some of the same identical texts have been translated once, twice, three times, four times, specifically because in order to achieve maximum similarity with the original text, both conceptual, also linguistic, grammatical, syntactic, philosophical, and so on and so forth. So this zeal that the Georgian monks had towards becoming part of Christian ecumeny was translated in their vigorous attempt to translate everything that was going on and to adapt it to Georgian context.
Right.
So,
So, yeah, I want to turn now to your own experience because I've been recently reading Robert Blake's sort of semi-autobiography. It was actually a biography compiled by his son, Igor. Robert Blake, for those watching, I consider to be one of the founders of Georgian studies in the United States. And I've read Nikoloz's work where he cites Robert Blake, so I know he's very familiar with him. And Robert Blake talks about, I mean, he was a sort of fantastic scholar who knew something like 14 languages, most of them ancient languages. But he says a couple of things. One of the things he says is what I've been trying to get at, that in some sense, Georgian monks and scribes played this sort of key role in the Middle Ages of preserving certain texts by translation and so on, that if we hadn't received them or we haven't got them, we would have been lost, and we wouldn't have known some parts of the Gospels without them. That was very important role that was played. But he also talks about his struggles when he's trying to see these manuscripts and catalog them and translate them. It was okay in Georgia; he could do that. Ekaterine Gedevanishvili was one of his mentors and helped him find those manuscripts and cataloging them and all that. But when he went to Mount Athos or to other like Mount Sinai, to St. Catherine's, it wasn't so easy. There was a lot, sometimes, particularly from the Greeks, there was a lot of resistance to exposing the Georgian role at this time. So I want to ask you, what is it like now for you as a scholar? When you go to monasteries like St. Catherine's or Mount Athos, how are you received as a scholar of Georgian manuscripts? Is it now a different situation where the role of Georgians and their role as an autocephalous church is accepted and recognized, and that it should be respected, or is there still this resistance?
It varies and depends from monastery to monastery, but in general the situation has improved dramatically from late 80s since the Soviet period, because there was a general mistrust towards Soviet scholars in general. It was not just about the Georgians, but the Iron Curtain was an Iron Curtain in that respect as well. But to be honest, I'm again not particularly qualified to do this because I haven't done that much research in those monasteries. Although I've spent a lot of my
Mm.
childhood and younger years in those manuscripts due to family reasons, because my father was involved in all that. And what I was able to do is certainly trace this development, because earlier there was mistrust. Earlier there were all sorts of incidents when there were attempts to to hide a particular manuscript, to just not show them, to just ignore a scholar, and this has become less and less common, I
Right.
believe. But
Mm.
places vary. Like Mount Athos has become way more open these days than
Okay. Yeah.
was earlier.
Right.
Jerusalem, it could be more problematic.
Right.
I don't know
Right.
really. But
Right.
yeah,
Right.
but the major thing is that the Greek monks and the owners, they've come to realize that it's also their heritage, and they're really proud of
Right.
this heritage. And
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Right. I mean, because what we're talking about here, I guess, is politics.
yeah,
In many cases, it's the rejection or the resistance to, for example, recognition of the Georgian Church as a fully autocephalous church with its own patriarch. Right. That has always been contested in the Eastern Church by various Orthodox churches, of course, Russian Orthodox Church in particular. And one of the things that you address in all your work is this relationship between politics, the state, and the church. And, it's not unusual for churches to be involved in politics. It was obviously the case in England, my own homeland, where the church played a very powerful role in political life. Could you talk a little bit more about that relationship between church and state in Georgian history?
yeah. First of all, I think that this distinction, that very clear-cut distinction between church and state,
Yeah,
doesn't really work in medieval Georgian context. Um, However, in a sort of contemporary retrospection or perception of medieval state of affairs, very much so, we like to talk about the interaction of church and state in medieval Georgia. And two of the most famous episodes, well, maybe several, but two of the most famous episodes is the interaction of Grigol Hanster, Gregory of Hanster, and the local ruler Ashot, or, for example, the famous or infamous Council of Ruisi and Urbanici that comes up in all sorts of discussions every time there's an issue with the church or issue with the church and state relationship in Georgia. These episodes come sort of pop up. I think in reality this distinction didn't really work. The distinction was not that clear cut because because the, for example, in the 12th century, in the 13th century, what happened really often is that loyal or disloyal patriarchs were banished, and loyal patriarchs were brought in, and the loyalties, kinship, feudal system, and networks within all these people transcended the more rigid church and state differentiation,
right.
I
Yeah,
believe, especially in the later Middle Ages, when all the patriarchs were Bagratids, pretty much all of them, and
right.
and the rivalry, if any, transcended this distinction. I think the only example is could be probably not just the only, but the most sort of vocal example is probably 18th century during Vakhtang the Sixth, when it really, and afterwards, when really sort of a discussion or a kind of a polemic arose within Georgian intellectual circles of what constitutes the essence of Georgian identity, whether it's religious, essentially religious, or secular, structured around the man in the panther skin. I think the establishment of printing press was a crucial a litmus paper that created this kind of an antagonism between
Mm.
the ecclesiastic and the more
Yeah.
secular-minded circles. Yeah.
Yeah. Fascinating. Um, Question too about this homeland language faith that Ilya Chevchavadze talked about. and it goes back, as we say, to the medieval period where Georgia, the Georgian church and the faith was considered something very particular, right? That the Georgian church had a very special role to play in the world of Christendom, right? And this is something, of course, that was imbibed and repeated by Zviad Gamsa, right? Uh, uh, you know, how did this sense that the Georgian church had this sort of special, sort of celestial role in the world of, that it had a special place in God's heart, if you like, or it had, it was very, it was sort of a very important entity that separated it out from other churches. How did that come about? How, I mean, and how, yeah, just tell us about that if you can.
Yeah, I think there were several very distinct eras when these tropes emerged in Georgian writing. One of them was, for example, the seventh century, when I believe the conversion of Georgia was written. So many Georgian scholars think it's an earlier text. I do not think so. I think it's a seventh century composition. And the seventh century, for example, was a period of general upheaval or depression or sort of transformation or crisis in the Eastern Mediterranean, because of the sack of Jerusalem, the rise of Arabs, and the general disillusionment in sort of Christian politics, the possibility of an eternal Christian empire, and the rise of Greek chauvinism coincides with this period, and the rise of sort of Georgian chauvinism or Georgian ethnic sensibilities also
Mm,
coincides is a kind of a response to this period. So I think
mm,
a text such as the Conversion of Georgia, which is specifically written to highlight Moktsevai Kartlisa, I mean, is to highlight Georgia's centrality, not
right,
just its peripheral role, but centrality
right,
within
right.
universal Salvation history of the
Yeah,
Georgian language. Is a response to this crisis of the seventh century, and I
right.
also think that there's something
Absolutely.
like the praise and glory of the Georgian language, which is
Yeah.
ascribed to could rather be a seventh century or eighth century composition, because this is
Mm,
exactly when this focus on language emerged. The other very distant and distinct period is 10th and 11th centuries, and this is
right.
also a, a, a reaction against the Byzantines. As I said, the Athenites were really keen to sort of sacralize markers of ethnicity, such as ethnicity as such. Because, for example, in the life of Ilaria the Georgian, the Mother of God is the exclusive protectress of the Georgian nation. That's how she's
Mm,
presented, and
mm,
not just exclusively so vis-a-vis the Byzantines. So the
right,
whole point is that she's our protectress
right,
in
right,
this
right,
area and not yours.
right.
And these kinds of
Mm,
moments of sacralization emerged quite often. Also, actually, what I also try to argue in my book is that a crucial moment in this process was the period when the various Georgian principalities, both Western and Eastern Georgia, began their first ties with the Russians, with Moscow. Because whereas the Greeks of this period were rather unimpressed or less impressed by the Georgian claims of the Mother of God, the Second Jerusalem, or the having hundreds of major relics, when the Greeks were sort of less impressed, the Russians were very impressed. And if you read the travelers, they're sort of they're writing down all the relics that Georgians have. The Dadianis
mm,
have the belt,
mm,
the Kutateli has something else, and
yeah,
so on. And later on, in the 17th century, 18th century, late 16th century,
mm,
these items, these symbols of sacredness
mm,
of Georgianness,
mm,
they've turned into diplomatic instruments of just
mhm.
bargaining chips. And then
Okay.
we have many examples when the Georgian
Mm,
king is sort of happy to
mm,
send this item in exchange for
right,
political protection.
right,
And
right.
this goes on in the 18th and also in the 19th
Interesting.
century.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to bring you back to, I
Sorry.
think this may have to be the last question, But your book is called, or at least the one you published in 2024, Sanctity, Gender and Authority in Medieval Caucasia. Um, Gender is a very important word there. Sanctity, gender, and authority. And of course, gender, when we think about the role of women in Georgian and Christianity, not only women in terms of the religious world, like say Nino, but in the secular world, like Tamara and Ketavan. Why did you put gender in the title there, and how important is that?
Mm.
How important is it for us to understand the role that women played and why they played that role in the development of Georgian Christianity?
Yes. Yeah, I think it's crucial for several reasons. For the main reason is obviously the person, very complicated and controversial person of Saint Nino, and I think she was not necessarily universally revered saint in the early period of her cult. And what we can observe for sure is that her cult was reanimated, strongly reanimated under Queen Tamar, because while earlier we just probably just one or maybe two images of Saint Nino, and she's not really central in those in those images. She becomes very central in the 13th century, and her cult becomes central in the
Mm,
13th
mm,
century. And the crucial text and the main bit of text that I focus on in these chapters in the book is the homily by Nikoloz Aleksidze, the patriarch Nikoloz I Aleksidze, who was loyal to Tamar, and he wrote what we would call the defense of female apostolic mission. So
mm.
what he basically says is that he sort of gathers all these people in Svetitskhoveli, and he says that I have to say something serious to you. And he begins his homily by saying that earlier people refused to accept, challenged the illuminator's gender, saying that the woman could not have done this. And then he says that I order you to shut your mouths, and now I'm going to explain to you why a woman was supposed to do this, and
Right,
specifically a woman could have
right.
converted. And obviously, he resonates, and therefore because Tamar has her own issues of legitimacy, right?
Right.
It was
Right.
not that clear cut that she was supposed to be queen. So
Yeah.
the whole discussion in the book is how the political issue of political legitimacy and issue of just religious legitimacy of apostolic mission were intertwined in Georgian political rhetoric.
Yeah. Yeah. It must
But
have.
just
Yeah.
one
Yeah.
more point is that what I discuss in later chapters is that this female identity of Georgian Christianity was eagerly taken up by the Russian narratives, because from the Russian perspective, Georgia was essentially a land of female saints. So if you read 18th century or early 19th century Russian perception writings about Georgian Christianity, the saints are basically all women. That no male figure transpires in those narratives. And yeah, I also claim in the book that Ilya Chauchawadze was being a mastermind of pretty much everything in the second half of 19th century Georgia. He also had a specific mission of masculinizing Georgian
Right. Right.
Christianity, because he
Right.
was picking up those
Right.
extremely male figures to sort of
Yeah. Right. Right. I
reanimate.
mean, I can imagine there must have been a lot of resistance in
Yeah.
medieval Georgia to this female, the
Yes, there
role
was.
of females in defining Georgian Christianity. But let's turn to the questions, Nicholas. Thank you so much for that discussion. It was absolutely fascinating, and we could
Thank
go
you.
on, I know, but I do have to turn to the audience. And I have there's one question here from Eka Imelishvili, and she asks, Western European monastic manuscripts often have doodles or marginalia written by a distracted scribe. Do features like that survive in medieval Georgian manuscripts?
Oh yes, they do, and they're hilarious. Some of them are extremely inappropriate, just like in Western Europe. Some of them are just regular, just life of a monk being exhausted, or his sight failing him, or his cursing his bishop for making him copy these manuscripts. And in this sense, they're very similar to what's going on in Western Europe because it's the same life. It's a monk
Right.
sort of struggling with his
Right.
chores and
Yeah.
and yeah, I wish someone had someone published these because they're
Right.
fairly
Right.
entertaining.
Yeah, yeah. I work in the archives too. You know, when I work on the First Republic, it's some of the juiciest parts of the documents that I read are the marginalia that are written by ministers or their assistants, right? Where the truth really comes out. You know, you've got
Mm,
an official document, but then you've got somebody scribbling on it and say, "This is rubbish," you know. But that doesn't go into the official record, right? It's
mm.
just something else. Um,
One of my favorite marginalia is the one saying just plainly, "God, I'm hungry." It's
uh, okay, we have another one. I think, yes, it says here, you mentioned limited records of Georgian vernacular language surviving in graffiti. Can you speak to the average literacy in that period? Um, I'm guessing we're talking about
um,
the
yeah.
medieval period there.
No, I can't really. I haven't really researched this topic, but it is interesting that the graffiti in general, and these unofficial inscriptions, they betray a certain divergences and from our knowledge of standard how standard Georgian worked both grammatically and in terms of language, but also in terms of writing. So there's a certain narrative in the history of in the histories of Georgian literature that this kind of register or kind of grammar existed up to that point. Then this changed, and something else happened, and new developments occurred, and so on. Or in terms of writing, that these kinds of shapes existed in this period, and Khedruli appeared at a certain period, then before was Nuskhuri, and so on and so forth. So once in a while, not often, but sometimes we discover an inscription that challenges these perspectives and perceptions,
Mm.
both from the graphical perspective and also from the linguistic perspective. So I think in reality, this was way more complicated.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. So
So when you
the
talk about graffiti, what are we talking about exactly?
inscriptions are by pilgrims mostly. These are pilgrim inscriptions on the facades of churches or in the interiors of churches.
And would
There's just
they
yeah,
would carve them on, they would scratch them
I
on,
would
or
scratch them on. There are many, I mean, all from all sorts of people. But the most interesting ones are, I think, they're from the 8th and 9th century on in Ateni. Interestingly, Ateni, the church in the middle of Georgia near Gori, has one of the biggest collections of medieval graffiti because it was situated on
right,
one of the crucial trade
right,
routes. So
right,
that's what
right.
we have.
So this graffiti would be in multiple alphabets or multiple.
Yeah, yeah,
Right,
and we have poems, for example, written in the verses, not poems, but verses written in graffiti
right.
um, from the ninth
Oh,
century. And these occasional discoveries, they always challenge our knowledge of standard
yeah,
histories.
right.
Um,
Yeah. Okay, couple more questions. Can you say more? This is from Diana Zadura, who's in Poland. Can you say more about medieval texts glorifying the Georgian language?
Yeah, well, the most famous text is the one that we mentioned a couple of times. It's literally called "The Praise and Glory of Georgian Language," which is a certain apocalyptic text, and it all is all about Georgian. It goes on saying that Georgian language was buried like Lazarus, and Lazarus, it's its other name. And that everyone will be judged in this language. So it's a very typical apocalyptic, hyper bombastic praise of the Georgian language, and I'm fairly convinced that these sentiments uh, existed in among Georgian communities in isolated monasteries like Mount Sinai or Marsaba Monastery or other Palestinian monasteries where Georgians were surrounded by often hostile and chauvinistic Greek monks And this was a certain kind of a reaction or
Right. Right.
attempt to establish themselves.
Yeah.
And other texts that are sort of more serious in their attitudes, like the lives of the Athenite fathers, written in the 10th century and the early 11th centuries, they're also very much focused on Georgian language. But in most of these cases, these discussions occur in the context of where Georgians constitute a minority in terms
I
of
see. Yeah.
ethnicity. And that
Right.
happens quite
Right.
often.
Right.
Yeah, there are many other examples as
Yeah.
well.
Another question for you. What stands out about the religious perspective of Georgian monks compared with their Greek or Palestinian peers?
It really depends on the context and
Mhm.
in what context or what period
Mhm.
or um,
Mhm.
um,
I mean,
because
were they
one of the
particularly defensive about, the Chalcedonian identity of Christ, or I mean,
so.
were there debates and conflicts about this?
Yeah, in the 12th century, well, in the 12th century, there was a whole issue that you actually mentioned, Stephen, the issue of or the legitimacy of the orthocephaly of the Georgian Church,
Right.
and yeah, especially the Georgian monks in Syria on the Black Mountain, I think but also those, especially those in Greece as well, in Chalkidiki in on Mount Athos, they often had to answer to these challenges by the Greeks that you're not really Orthodox and you
Right.
do not
Right.
really deserve ecclesiastical autonomy. And for example, someone like Ephrem, the minor Ephrem Tsire in the 12th century, he composed an entire ready-made answers to Byzantine allegations of how to respond to such claims. And he sourced from Byzantine, Roman, and Latin texts all the arguments that would substantiate Georgian right to ecclesiastical autonomy or orthodoxy. So what the Georgians came up with in these communities is a counterattack. So they mounted a
Right.
counterattack, claiming that it was not us, but it was you, the Byzantines, who do not have a continuity of orthodoxy because you guys had iconoclasm and we never had iconoclasm. You were
Mm.
burning icons, whereas when those iconophiles and those icons found refuge in Georgia, so they
Right.
often use this argument as a counterattack against Byzantine allegations and to claim uninterrupted continuity of
Got it.
Chalcedonian orthodoxy in Georgia.
Right. Okay, good, excellent. It seems that this is another question. It seems that most of the medieval Georgian texts discussed in historical literature come from monasteries outside Georgia. How robust were the production of texts in
Mm.
monasteries within Georgia, and do these texts survive?
Mm. No, I don't think that there's such that this is the rule actually, because the monasteries in southwestern Georgia, currently in Turkey, they were the
Mm,
biggest scriptoria actually. They were the
mm,
largest centers of Georgian learning, and I'd say most of medieval Georgian manuscripts from the 10th, 11th centuries they were produced in those monasteries specifically, and then often sent away to Mount Athos or Sinai or elsewhere. So actually, those were the centers of production, and then they were sent. There were many cases when the process was reversed, but the epicenter of Georgian learning and writing was there. But also later on in other parts, for example, I have images which I forgot to show of monasteries like Shiom for example, or
right,
David Kareji or Vardzia and others. These were important producers of manuscripts, and not just those
right,
like
right.
Shuamta and many others.
Yeah, yeah. I'm going to go back also now. Oops, we've lost something here. Oh, here's some slides, right?
Mm,
I'm going to go back to my work in the archives in Georgia during the First Republic when there was a secular government, the Social Democratic government under
mm,
Noy Jordania, and of course the church that regained its autocephaly in 1917, and or its recognition, let's say, of autocephaly by the Russian church. But where there was this conflict about where these relics and manuscripts should be? Who should have control and
Mhm.
authority over these manuscripts and relics? There was a big controversy in Gelati. Some of the relics were got out into the black market, and so the Georgian government decided to move those manuscripts and keep them under lock and key under government control. I mean, that's a dispute, isn't it? There's this idea of who owns these manuscripts, who is it, the nation? Is it the church? I mean, how do you look at those disputes, and where are we today in terms of that conflict that often emerges?
We we are in a very complicated place, and it's because it's a big issue these days, and I actually would sort of try to avoid this question because it's a sensitive topic now.
Okay, okay,
Because um, the Georgian Church, it claims to be the owner of all ecclesiastic items or lands or churches or anything, but
mm,
where is the boundary? Where's the line
right,
really? What
right,
constitutes?
right,
What if a manuscript was commissioned by a rich Georgian feudal in the 14th century for his
right,
own family? So what happens to that church, to
right,
that manuscript? So it's an open question. It's a question of
right,
ownership, a question of power. And incidentally, I'm currently working on another project of mine. I'm going to publish the diaries of Oliver Wardrop and his correspondence with his sister.
mm,
And in one of the entries, there was a couple of entries in his diary when he was in Georgia in in 1990, is that he was asked by the Patriarch of Georgia to sort of liaise with the government relate in relation to Gelati and he tried him to not get involved in this discussion actually.
right, right.
That is a hot topic. Yeah.
Yeah, because when this question relating to where the manuscripts are, and you mentioned the monasteries that survived in Georgia, but of course most of the manuscripts now are in, I guess, the National Center of Manuscripts,
Yes.
or in the National Archives, right? That just in terms of this understanding that these manuscripts, because of this very close relationship between faith and nation, right? That to some level they are national rather than religious, right? That they belong to the people and its history. Um, but we'll pass on that one because it is, as you say, very
Yeah.
sensitive issue.
Because as we
Um,
speak, decisions are being made. So
yeah,
yeah,
right,
all that.
right. So here's an interesting question. Were there any Georgian nuns who transcribed texts? You mentioned
Yes.
that Russians perceived Georgia as a country with female saints, but not a lot is known about them. Can you say a few more words about women who played a role in Georgian
Mm.
medieval Christianity? I mean, yeah, that's an interesting question. Nuns, were they scribes as well?
Yes, there were, and we are aware of several names. And there's a friend and colleague of mine who works on this particular topic, and she's way more knowledgeable, and not necessarily in the early, sort of in the Middle Ages, but in the early modern period, there's certainly more nuns, but also not just nuns, but secular women who are involved in producing literature in general, or at
Right,
least we know, we just happen to know their names in the later period. But I do not, to be honest, and this I feel guilty about this, is that I do not have a sort of systematic knowledge of this question. Uh,
right. Yeah, I mean, but I'm guessing the scribes do identify themselves when
oh
they,
yes, they do, and we do have several cases when a female scribe is identified. Yeah.
yeah, interesting. Um, okay,
So I think we
good.
missed the first question. There's a
Yeah, the
question that
question,
was.
okay, let's go back to this one. Yeah, I apologize to Zurab. I didn't see it, but it's right there at the top. His question is, I always wonder how history explains the overlapping of 16 letters in the Georgian and Armenian alphabets. I taught elementary Georgian for over 3 years to expats, including philologists of Persian, Arabic, Turkish, Hebrew. They noted that even some grammatical rules lost in these ancient languages are present in Georgian. So, I mean, this isn't your sphere, but when you look at manuscripts, do you see some preservation of, let's say, syntax or grammar that other languages, if you like, have dropped or disappeared, but
Hmm.
Georgian has preserved them? Is that
Hmm.
something you've
Um,
noticed?
yes, because I know I don't know Arabic, for example, but I know Greek, and what I'm working on right now is these metaphrastic texts that they attempt to imitate verbatim the Greek syntax. So what we could trace in these cases is that how some of the forms that have been either fossilized or become redundant in Greek, in medieval Greek, how they've survived in
Uh-huh.
went on in Georgian language. And this has been researched by several outstanding scholars, yeah, in general.
Okay. Yeah. Right.
Who is my colleague? Yeah, yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Who is the colleague that works on
Yeah,
non-scribes?
I think Ketevan does. I think
Yeah.
she does.
Yeah.
She works at the
Yeah.
National Archives.
Okay. Excellent. Now a question from Daci Rukhadze. Georgian kings have some relics to Russian emperors as a gift. Did Russia return these relics after the annexation of Georgia? Also, there is a suspicion that a robe of Jesus is in Russia and not in Mskheta anymore. Can you tell us
That's
about this?
That's a huge topic. Yes. First of all, the story of the tunic is controversial because, according to some Russian narratives, what happened is that when Shah Abbas I sacked Mtskheta, he snatched away the tunic and he gave it as a present to the Russians. So, if you ask the Russian church, the tunic of the Lord is now held in the Kremlin, of
Right.
all places.
Right.
However, it's not universally acknowledged. For example, other travelers who travel to Mtskheta after the event, they still identify the tunic in Mtskheta. Well, yeah, that's that. But as for the relics, those relics were used as diplomatic exchange. Yes, for
Right.
example, one of the topics that I discuss in the book is the story of the cross of Nino, or the story of the Holy Nail, actually. And these relics that were taken to Russia by the Georgian royal family in the 18th century, the Ekaterine and Bagratids took all their relics together with Russia to Russia. They were sort of returned. Some of those were returned in exchange, I would say, in exchange for Georgia's political independence. So, with the manifesto of annexation, these relics were returned as a gesture of
Right.
goodwill.
Right. 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 Yeah.
But that happened also later on. For example, the thumb of, I think it was the thumb of, or the toe of Queen Ketevan that was sent to Moscow by her son. I think it was
Okay.
returned at some point in the late 19th century.
So the toe survived the tortures.
Sorry,
Somehow the toe survived the tortures.
the toe survived, yeah.
Yeah.
So it was one
Oh,
of those morbid cases when,
yeah.
so interesting that as soon as his mother died, was killed,
Yeah.
Timur immediately converted her body into
Into
into some
different.
political capital.
Yeah. Okay. A different way of looking at things in those days, right?
Yeah.
Um, so we don't have any more questions. Okay, here we have one just popped up. What does the Georgian Church's religious transcribing work look like these days? Is it even relevant anymore?
Uh, Transcribing work. I'm not sure I understand.
I'm not.
You mean
Hmm.
copying manuscripts?
Yeah, I mean, for example, is the copying of manuscripts still going on? I'm guessing it is. It's
It
still,
is,
the,
but
the art
for
of calligraphy and the art of
yes.
illuminated manuscripts continues, right?
It does, and it's very much alive. And actually, the National Center of Manuscripts has a big project of developing and calligraphy amongst school children, and they organize competitions, and there has been recently. I think they've started a project of copying the Man in the Panther skin. I think they want to produce a big manuscript of
Mm,
that involves many different people.
mm, mm,
Yeah, it is, but it's not. It doesn't have any sort of intellectual value. It's purely artistic and
right.
yeah.
Okay. There's another
Oh,
one that's
one more question.
popped up. I was going to ask one, but here we are. Um,
Yeah.
in the political discourse, Orthodox Christianity has at times been invoked by certain actors to justify Georgia's closer relations with the Russian Federation as a representative of Eastern Christianity. To what extent, however, does the history of medieval Georgian Christianity support an alternative interpretation, one that situates Georgia's historical and civilizational orientation closer to Europe? And how is that used or can be used in Georgian politics today?
Well, that's a huge question, and that also involves many different periods. One of the episodes from medieval Georgian writing that I like is again the life of Euphemius the Athonite, and the story goes saying that the Georgian monks were harassed by the Greeks on Mount Athos, and the abbot and others they just can't take it anymore. They just don't want to be there anymore. And then the Georgian monk they find out that there are other Georgians, the Iberians living on the far other end of the continent, and they organize an expedition and decide to leave and check out the kinsfolk. And then the Patriarch of Antioch, I believe, or of Constantinople, or he sort of begs them to stay, not to go there because they're Latins and they're not to be trusted. And it's one of those nice examples of Georgians looking for was a familiar strangers, as it were, of
Right, right.
beyond the Greeks, beyond those Byzantines who were co-Orthodox, but antagonistic in so many different ways. So I think those
Yeah.
distinctions of East, West, North, South are not really relevant to this period because
Mhm.
just like Russia was and is perceived as a co-religionist but politically antagonistic,
Yeah.
the perceptions of Byzantium of Constantinople was very much similar to in the medieval period or pre-modern
Right,
period as
right,
we perceive Russia these days.
right, right, right. You're talking about the antagonism between the
The
Byzantine,
antagonism,
yeah,
yes. The
the
antagonism of being co-religionist, however,
right,
being
right,
extremely antagonistic
yeah,
for.
yeah, okay,
But for example, one of my favorite examples is the development of the iconography of Saint George slaying the Emperor Diocletian of a
hmm
figure, of a human figure with a halo.
hmm
Many scholars, and I think rightly so, claim that the whole iconography, the reason why it became so popular in Georgia, actually, Saint George slays just Diocletian, he doesn't slay the dragon in
right,
Georgia, was because it was implicitly meant that Saint George, the personification of Georgia, is slaying a Byzantine emperor par
okay, yeah,
excellence, actually.
yeah, interesting, yeah, um, yeah. So here is I'm just going to. So we don't have any more questions. Um, I just would like to ask you about this relationship between religion and identity in Georgia. Very quickly, I know we haven't got much time, but whenever you read polls in Georgia about people's values and attitudes, the Georgian church is always the most trusted institution, and between 80 and 85% of Georgians will say they are Christians, and not that they go to church at all necessarily, but that they have deep faith, right, an identity with the Georgian church. When we think about other national identities in Europe, right, of course, the Polish church and the Polish nation are closely associated, but then there are other countries where maybe the marker of national identity is language, perhaps, or particular, defined territory or imperial legacy or something like this. Um, but in Georgia, it seems to be the church, right, that holds this very important role, or the faith. How do you explain that? I mean, you've been talking in this talk very interestingly about the geopolitical situation at the time where Georgians feel isolated and they're sort of defending their identity, and language comes up as a way to defend their distinctiveness. How does in the 21st century today, why is it that this confluence between faith and nationality is so strong?
Right. I think there could be several answers, and I think one and main answer, so but my view or interpretation is that uh, eh, people seek stability and a stable institution. And since the collapse of the Soviet Union, actually, the only stable institution or the only institution with a strong sense of stability was the church.
Mm,
No other institution had anything remotely resembling stability. So I think the church
mm,
has this projects this strong sense
mm,
of resilience and stability. And
mm,
in this context, I think the figure of and so when people seek stability, they go to church probably. And the other reason is I think the personality of Patriarch Ilya. Patriarch Ilya was an extremely charismatic person, especially in the late Soviet era.
yeah.
It is I think his personal charisma really invigorated Christianity in many ways,
Okay. Yeah.
especially because he founded so many monasteries in the
Right.
early
Right.
19th. So many monks and priests
Right.
were
Right.
made. And
Mm,
but on the other hand, the third reason I think, but the two reasons are sort of connected. The third reason is the personality of Zviad Gamsakhourdia, say, and the nature of the
mm,
national movement in the late 70s and 80s,
mm,
because Gamsakhourdia's and his followers, or Kostavas for that matter, political language was extremely religious. It was
yeah.
very
Mm,
steeped in religion
mm,
and religious
mm,
tropes, yeah,
mm,
allusions to medieval Georgian religious
yep.
writing. So
Mm,
these two sentiments have been brewing from, I think, from the
got
beginning of
it. Yeah.
the 70s.
Yeah.
Also, it was a
Mm,
certain, but what is important, I think, is that these two did not really intersect or intersect very rarely. So, Patriarch Ilya and Zviad Gamsakhourdia were fairly antagonistic persons. They didn't
mm,
really like each other at
mm,
all, and they
mm,
had all their followers there were
mm,
quite different in their perspective of
mm,
what constitutes Georgian
mm,
essence, the essence of Georgian Christianity. So,
right.
because of all sorts of different trends and different
Right. Right.
undercurrents, I
Yeah.
think that's one of the reasons. Yeah.
Right. I mean, of course, it's contextual because, again, going back to the First Republic, or even the period leading up to the First Republic, Georgian church was not that popular. In fact, there was a great deal of anti-clericalism, right, in Georgian society, which is very different now. Okay,
Yes.
good. That was absolutely wonderful, fascinating. I'm so pleased we had you. And I'm going to turn it back now to Salome, who can wrap up and tell us what fruity, beautiful discussions we may come up with for the future of this series. But yeah, Salome, I'm going to hand it
Thank you.
again. Nikoloz, thank you so much
Thanks
for
so
being
much,
with
Stephen.
us. Yeah, yeah.
It was a
Thank you
pleasure.
so much, Nicholas, and thank you, Stephen, for this. And I want to really thank the audience as well for wonderful engagement,
Yeah.
because we had fantastic questions coming through that kept everything going. I want to flag that we have this QR code here for anyone who's watching now or watching later on the recording, where you can see more information and all the recordings of the past sessions on our website. The next webinar will be in early 2026 in January, at the end of January, the 31st at 1 p.m. On a Saturday. So please mind this, that usually this will be on Sundays, but this time it will be on Saturday. And it will be entitled Keeping the Georgian Language Alive, Poets, Legislators, and Teachers. Of course, we talked a little bit about language today, and because it's such an important part of our culture and identity, we will continue to talk about language from a different angle. The speakers are to be confirmed because we do have a bit of time until the end of January, so but do register, please, and that way you can get a reminder so you don't miss this event as it's coming up. We will also have schedule for visit to the um, Library of Congress likely here to look at some of the religious texts that Dr. Aleksidze just talked about, like the manuscripts from Mount Sinai and other materials that are also available. And I will also let you know that there will be some interesting um, display at Harvard next year as well. That you should continue to stay in touch and get announcements related to those materials. So, but before we say goodbye, I wanted to flag that there are some databases and materials here that Professor Aleksidze recommended as related topics for anyone who's interested in learning about more. We will also post these links, active links, when we upload the recording of this on YouTube. But Nikoloz, would you tell us a little bit about these databases and what people will find there if they were to go and try to learn more?
Yeah, so the Titus database is basically it has basically many medieval Georgian texts digitized and uploaded. They're searchable and they're one of the most important resources for any medievalist, really. So all published medieval Georgian texts are there. Also, some of those are not published. Both secular, religious translations, not original texts, they can be found there. The second database is something that I was involved and I co-created it. It's the Cult of Saints in Late Antiquity database. And this database covers the origin and development of the Cult of Saints in all of Christendom, from the British Isles all the way to Iran, in late antiquity. And I was responsible for Georgian and Armenian texts. So I've uploaded. Oh, sorry, I've typed in relevant texts. I've written commentary. They're quite extensive commentaries. And so if people are interested in this topic, it is an excellent database. You can search in various ways, search topics of your interest and so on. And digital Podlian is also something that I was involved in the early days of my my life in Oxford, but not necessarily at this stage. They've started digitizing some of the most important items from the Wardrop collection of Georgian books and manuscripts at the Bodleian libraries. For example, this famous 11th century manuscript from Jerusalem is digitized. The petition of the Georgian people is also the famous petition is digitized. Others as well. Other manuscripts are also digitized, and it's worth checking out because they're very high quality, very well done. These are just three. Yeah.
Wonderful.
I must say I'm looking forward to your book or your edited volume on the Marjory and Oliver correspondence.
Oh, yes.
It would be absolutely fascinating. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Once it's ready, please let us know so we can add it to the links here so folks can get to know it. Thank you once again, everyone. Thank you for the conversation, for all the time you've given us, and we look forward to continuing the series in 2026. And until then, happy holidays and happy New Year.
Thank you.
Happy New Year.
Bye-bye.
Bye.